into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Pod Damn America, the goth podcast for dumb idiots, and my spooky cat here. Hello, say hello to Murray, everyone who's watching on YouTube. I'm Jake Flores, and that's Anders Lee.
Anders J. Lee here, tuning in from, we're a sitcom podcast kind of. I'm in New York, you're in LA, need a third person in Chicago. Although most sitcoms in Chicago are in the suburbs, so I guess that's doable.
Oh, I thought you were saying, you know, we're like all those sitcoms where one character's in New York and one character's in LA, which is not a thing. I don't think.
No, we're just the topography of the American sitcom is explored in this show, or is captured in this show.
We're elitists. We are in the only 2 cities that exist in America, and the rest of you are in flyover states. Which,
yeah.
I will increasingly be probably living with you at some point as it gets more difficult to live in these fucking things. But that's for another episode. Hello, Anders. I want to talk about something today that I've been meaning to talk about for a long time. I read a book. Surprise.
Bati fucking dog. And a guy reading books over here.
I know. Feel pretty high and mighty about this. This is not an episode about where Mountain Dew Baja Blast comes from. I've got an actual book for you this week. I did actual research outside of Wikipedia and shit. Sometimes we talk about theory on the show. You know, I like to make a big brained, big bad leftist podcast where we read big, thick tomes and fill our head with radical theory and talk about it. But you know, we are also working people, and it's difficult. It's difficult to balance these things. So we have to do all sorts of things to make it all work. And it's only every once in a while that I really get a good book in my head. I'm like, this is gonna be the shit, dude. This is gonna be one of those smart ass podcasts that I am not ashamed to tell people that I made. Much different than the Mountain Dew Baja Blast episode. Check out our Patreon, everyone. I did an episode about Mountain Dew Baja Blast, and it's surprisingly interesting, I would say. So many people are saying it. But yeah, I got everything lined up this week, and I crammed a book, and I read all about it, and I thought about it, and now I've got a breakdown of it for you. We're talking today about The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, which you may be familiar with. If you're a leftist dork, it's a very popular book. It's essential reading if you are a leftist in the modern world, in my opinion. And I just did a Peggy Hill, in my opinion, in everyone's opinion. It's a very, very popular book. It's
Peggy Hill that was her thing, saying "in my opinion."
Yeah, she would say like "in my opinion," and then she would say something that is like conventional wisdom. So like, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, Pikachu is the most popular Pokemon, right? It's funny because she's like, she's got a very weird insecurity about not being able to speak Spanish, which she teaches and stuff. So she's got ego stuff going on. She says, in my opinion, a lot. In my opinion, The Wretched of the Earth is the seminal text on decolonization.
What do you think she would think about Wretched of the Earth? Because that seems like a book they're banning now in Texas. But is that something she would have taught? Probably not. But I wonder what she would think of it.
That's a really good question. She teaches middle school Spanish, so I don't think it would come up, although it should. Really,
I mean, if that happened to be the book that they were like, they just that was the only Spanish book that they happened to have, and they're like, well, you got to read something beyond the textbook. Let's get these kids a real book, and that's whatever it is in Spanish. That's what they have to read. Maybe that can be a good episode. Maybe, I mean, it's coming back. So I could see that, topical. book banning.
Mhm.
This is a thing we're drumming up.
I could, if this was to be inserted into a King of the Hill plot, I think the plot would be that Bobby reads it and becomes very militantly anti-decolonial, and he's like overdoing it, and it's hilarious, and he
Yeah.
like yells at his dad and stuff about it, which actually kind of was the plot of an episode. So I guess that's why I'm putting it there. But I don't
Was
know.
he read Zin?
I don't know what I think it's just that he hangs out with John Redcorn.
Okay.
And he like
That'll do it.
learns about colonization because there's an episode where he's like, "My, you saying the white man did this? I come from white men, and this is the first time hearing of it." It's like
Yeah.
really funny. It's like a Thanksgiving episode or something. But I don't know what Peggy Hill would do with this. Honestly, I don't know that she ever engages with politics or race on this level. Really, I want to say she'd be an ally, but um, something that we bring up on my other show, the King of the Hill podcast. That's my podcast. I don't know you sometimes. Is that's wishful thinking? I think because I think the lens of King of the Hill really just backs away from stuff like that because it is inherently still a really American show, and it's kind of both sidesy. And it would wreck the show to talk about something like this because what Fanon is doing is sort of exposing that us all getting along is not possible here, and that is kind of the ending of every King of the Hill episode is resolving things, and it's very like centrist in that way. It's very like Hank Hill comes into contact with a interesting character that he's initially disgusted by, and he's blows his mind and offends his sensibilities to have to interact with the Chris Rock voiced guest Def Jam comedian. But by the end of the episode, they both learned something from each other, and now that character is working for Hank, and but Hank's learned to tell jokes that are kind of edgy. Or that's a real episode, and that
I think your mother has low self-esteem. I remember that one. Yeah.
yeah. It's funny. He did a joke about like at the end of the episode, he's like, well, she would have had to have planned you. Like he did like a you're an unplanned baby joke, and it throws him off because that is actually a really edgy joke. And then Chris Rock is like, what the, oh my god, you told a fucking cool joke.
Did it.
And that there is no room for this sort of collaboration in the Wretched of the Earth, in my opinion.
Okay.
I've been thinking about the Wretched of the I've been thinking about Fanon a lot. I've been meaning to read this because I'm aware of what it's about, and I've caught pieces of it. And we make primers, we make media, right? That is sort of often I read the book so you don't have to, and so I don't feel like everyone needs to read every book, and I don't feel like you can't talk about Fanon without having read the book because what we're doing with the internet and with propaganda and stuff is putting these ideas out there. So I had a conception of this, but I really wanted to read it. One, because I'm a podcaster and it seems like the thing to do there, right? If I have the time, but also because of what it applies to, which I believe is like probably pretty aptly, easily argued Palestine at this point, Gaza, right? We're talking about colonization and potential decolonization and stuff, but also because I've been reading tons of Mexican history and I went to Mexico and I'm thinking about Mexico and stuff a lot. And I have kind of a lot of things going on in my brain about how this stuff applies to the indigenous people of this continent, who are all defined in various ways. One of them as Mexicans, one of those Mexican Americans, all kind of sharing roots of colonization that I think have been kind of erased. And we'll get to this eventually on the podcast. I have a new grand theory I'm sort of working through when we get to this Mexico stuff I'm working on. But I really think that a lot of us don't really think of ourselves as colonized because of, the things that capitalism does to our brains. And that might be a way that there's some potential for, some revolutionary sort of praxis in. I've been thinking a lot about how, like, Bernie handily won Nevada, and everyone went, holy shit, why the fuck did all these Mexicans vote for Bernie Sanders? And I think their answer might be in this book, and how, we are this untapped sort of part of the population that doesn't think of itself a certain way and should. But that's for another podcast. I really sunk my teeth into this fucking book, so without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. Actually, I'm going to waste some time. Another reason I thought of this is because I came upon something really disturbing recently, a horrifying piece of artificial intelligence slop just while I think it was on my For You page, or I don't know what the fuck I was doing on Instagram. But I found some Zionist propaganda where they used Pokemon, which was deeply offensive to me. And it has like the Pokemon theme playing in the background with an AI overlay that makes it sound like, with Hava Nagila, whatever the fuck that style of music is. Maybe I'll jam it in the podcast here when I edit. But they introduce all these Pokemons and they're like Pikachu, and it's Pikachu with the hat and everything.
Oh no.
And the curls, and then Shalomander, like Shalom, and his tail is a menorah, and I'm screaming at my phone, and the reason I'm screaming at it is I'm going, Pikachu would never do that, or would he? Interesting. Pokemon.
Be Jewish?
Not Jewish. Here's the thing. If it stopped there, totally fine with that, because that's just Jewish culture, and that great. Actually, I would love to beat a Jewish Pikachu. Then it goes on to like get Zionist. Like there's one they call like Zionist Machamp or some shit. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was like a second gen that I don't know the name of. And then I looked at the name of the account, and it's like Super Zionism fucking whatever, right? So okay, this is being used for the purposes of Zionism. Sorry, that's a good point. If it was just Jewish Pokemon, totally great. This was Zionist propaganda.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, wanting to put things in little balls and have them come out for. I'm trying to. There's an argument that Pokemon is Zionist. I could see it. Definitely.
Well, there's an argument that it's colonialist or that's colonized, whatever the fuck the word I'm looking for is, for sure. And that's so I started thinking about this Fanon stuff because I was thinking, you know what? I don't want to see my Pokemon become Zionist, but they are colonized people, right? We go around and we snatch them up and we make them work for us, and they, to see them like implemented as propaganda for a state. That's not. Pikachu is not from any state. He's not. Pokemon should have their own state. Right?
Yeah, it'd be cool if there's a Pokemon about the Pokemon realizing this and then fighting the trainers, which would come to think of it would actually not be. It would end pretty quickly, but it would be cool. They just kill everybody if they wanted to, but they don't. It's consciousness. They don't have the collective consciousness that they know that this Fanon stuff. They could benefit from it.
Honestly, that's a very good point about Pokemon. Is that the trainer wields no power over these things. A measly human with no superpowers. The Pokemon could easily kill them at any point, so they must use like a superstructure of implied violence to keep the Pokemon subservient, and that's all in this book, baby. And I think that should also be the last episode of the show. That would be really funny, is if they all turn on them and then they kill Ash Ketchum, who is now 35 or whatever.
And then we finally get the Brock and Misty scene.
Oh yeah. Anyways, I think that actually repurposing a Pikachu for the purpose of the colonizers' propaganda is something that would happen. Fanon would argue. But we also saw Pikachu this week charging the crowds in the streets of Istanbul, I think, in Turkey. It's been memed all over the place. There's a guy in an inflatable Pikachu suit at like some anti-Erdogan shit. I think I'm getting this right. Anyways, it's really cool. It's like one of those things that went around Instagram and everyone's like, wow, like 2025 is so crazy, so inspiring, Comrade Pikachu. I also saw a picture of that same guy possibly posing with the police. I don't know what's going on. But anyways, the image speaks for itself, right? Pikachu, he has two paths, right? He could choose to join the people in the streets, or he can make propaganda. Keep that in mind as we get into the book. So let's talk about the background of The Wretched of the Earth a little bit. It was written by Frantz Fanon in 1961. And he wrote it near the end of his life after having participated in the sort of Algerian Revolution or War of Independence or whatever the hell it's called, which was revolt against the French who had colonized Algeria. And let's talk about that a little bit before we get into his life. So France had colonized Algeria in the 19th century. This is very similar to like Vietnam and Indochina. There were, these colonial holdings that sort of, we'll get to what happens, but they're still around after World War II, and then things happen. So it had this weird status as like part of France as opposed to Indochina, where they were colonies in certain states. I don't know why that, for some reason, that supposedly plays into how this plays out.
Well, there were a lot of like people who were ethnically French who had lived in Algeria. I mean, it's similar to, all over the place. South Africa or Panama. You had people who were like essentially American and identified as American, but they lived in the zone, and that's a similar. They were French citizens, but they lived in Algeria, and they were like, "No, this is France." And then they were really mad when De Gaulle told them to go home.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's a good clarification. Yeah, there were there was like a class. There were multiple classes. There's like sort of a conception of a class of people called the Pied Noir. I don't know if I said that right.
Pied Noir MC.
Also Pied. Is that like feet? Is it
That's
literally-
like an extra. Isn't that like an extra house? Pied Noir. God, for anyone who speaks French, listening to this is going to be furious right now.
No, it's foot. I knew it was because like Pied.
Yeah, Peta. Yeah. Peta.
Oh.
Yeah, Philia. No, Blackfoot. Okay, why? What am I thinking of? That's like the extra house thing. Pied Noir. Pied Terre. Petty Terre. Anyway,
It's the
sorry.
pedophile house. So this is what Dave Chappelle's Native American name was in. I think he won the Chappelle show. He's Blackfeet. That's really weird.
Oh. You read
that's why it
this?
reminded me of that. Maybe. So, yeah, they were particularly brutal. We'll get to them later. So, early 20th century, there began to be some communist party organizing. There was like this party called the North African Star. And there was like a communist party, and France, sort of cracks down on them and dissolves these parties as they become increasingly radical. And let's see, World War II, France, it's so the process of World War II, obviously France is overtaken by Germany. It becomes Vichy France, and then the war plays out. But an interesting historical process here is that its stranglehold on its colonies tends to be weakened. Is something that people talk about. So that's like how possible argument for how these like revolutionary movements in its holdings like Vietnam, etc., came about, right? Because you get this demarcation, this event that changes things from the early 20th century, where there's still hangovers of the 19th century and colonization being outright endorsed and stuff like that. So you get these liberation parties that begin to form. They're somewhat factionalized. There's a lot of gritty detail to go in here that I don't have the time for, but it is probably in some interesting other texts. But prominent among them is the FLN, which is the what do you call, what does FLN stand for?
Liberation. I mean, it's in French, right?
National Liberation Front, but
Yeah.
in French, it's the
Yes.
letters. Yeah, you got it. So the FLN's the one we're going to be focusing on because it's the one that wins out, but there's also the MNA and other stuff like that. And this sort of culminates in 1956 after the war, the Battle of Algiers. There's a really great film about this that I've been meaning to watch. That came out 10 years later, 66, something like that. And the Battle of Algiers happens when the FLN has sort of been implementing guerrilla warfare as resistance to colonialization or to colonization. I'm going to keep saying the word weird like that. I don't trigger warning. I don't know. I can't stop.
It's like when people say abolishment instead of abolition.
Or like the one that drives me crazy is societal instead of social, because it's like this is just extra letters to say the same thing. You're just trying to sound smart.
Okay.
Because I don't know which one to say.
Damn. That's got me thinking. Societal and so. Okay, I guess they are the same thing.
It really, really bothers me, and it shouldn't. But I have every time like just fucking say social.
But isn't social even more meta and macro than societal? Like a society is a specific social unit, although a very broad one, and social is that's just any interaction between two humans.
I suppose, but I have the thing where you get mad at a word about this, like when people don't like the word. Trigger warning, moist. Doesn't bother me. Reminds me of brownies, but some people really hate it, and I hate the word societal.
I've literally too, which now has been forced upon me. That's someone at Merriam-Webster signed an executive order making literally basically meaningless.
Oh, they updated it because millennials destroyed it.
Yeah, so now it means nothing. It's just it just accentuates whatever the thing you're saying is. Accentuates isn't the right word there either. But what are we gonna do?
It means literally nothing. So, Battle of Algiers is interesting because if you read about it, like it depends where you read about it. You get a different fucking story. If you read about it from Fanon, we talk about it's framed as resistance, and we tell the whole story. It's a lot like Palestine. If you read about it in mainstream channels, increasingly Wikipedia. Honestly, if you read history on Wikipedia, you get the Western telling of the story, and that focuses on the fact that the FLN was bombing people. It was bombing buildings and stuff, and it was doing so as resistance. But the way that France would have told the story, especially if they'd won, is that this was terrorism, right? And there were I think there were some women that were the assassins and stuff involved in the thing that they cracked down on in Algiers. It sounds like a really cool story. I mean, watch the movie. Maybe we'll talk about that for the fucking bonus or something like that. And yeah, so the police basically call in France because they say we can no longer stay on top of this. So this results in a sort of one of these interesting things that happen in war, like an Alamo type situation where France ultimately wins this battle, but it causes the greater war. It's a war for independence that breaks out, and as it breaks out, France starts to lose UN support and things like that in terms of trying to this heightens a contradiction, right? And France is forced to justify what it's doing, which increasingly, I think, obviously, is just maintaining its colony, which for whatever reason, geopolitically at the time, I'm not entirely sure exactly why this happens, but that causes them to lose international support. Interesting, because I can see that going either way, but that's probably a whole story to itself. So eventually the FLN wins, and there's a guy named Ahmed Ben Bella who becomes the first president of Algeria, and they sort of implement this thing called a semi-presidential system that has a prime minister and a president, and it's sort of a republic, but it has it's sort of a social democracy type thing. It has socialist style reforms, but as the 20th century plays out, it's like many other parts of the third world. History happens, lots of things happen, and it does not turn into a European style social democracy. There's a civil war in the 90s, and eventually there's just sort of a gradual return to market economics, and that's as far as I get with my understanding of Algeria. But if you know about this, get us, educate me in the Discord, join our Patreon to do so, patreon.com/PodDamnAmerica, or just fucking tweet at me. I don't give a shit. So there are also some things that happened during the course of the war. I guess I wanted to touch on things that are very prescient. Like I was saying earlier, the depiction of the resistance as terrorists. It's very similar to what we're seeing with Palestine, Gaza, and do you condemn Hamas and all that stuff, right? There are state-sponsored dark organizations like this thing called the Main Rouge. The French deep state had this group called the Red Hand that would do their bidding. State-sponsored terrorism. That story is not told the same way. Well, why not, right? Obviously, history is written by the winners and the white people, and etc. And yeah. So, anyways, that's the background to where Fanon sort of comes in. Now let's talk about his life a little bit. He was born on the West Caribbean, French-occupied island of Martinique in the Caribbean. And in 1940, Martinique came under control of Vichy French Admiral George Robert. I'm going to assume this is pronounced. Otherwise, it's George Robert, which sounds like a Texas guy, Western fan. I don't know. I'm going to say George Robert, but I could be wrong. And Fanon, I think from skimming a little bit about him, he seems like it's a pretty typical intelligentsia. I think he came from like fairly bourgeois family and has somewhat of an opportunity to go off and learn things. But I don't know. I didn't do a deep dive here, so I could be wrong. That's just the whiff I get because of what happens next. The 1940. Okay, so during Georges Robert, Fanon experiences the terror of living under Vichy France because Vichy France is occupied by the fucking Nazis, and so it's heavily, evil and fascistic, and they've sort of given in to the Nazis. So the Nazis' rules are what they're living under, right? So first thing that happens to form this guy's worldview is seeing that, right? And then Robert is overthrown by the Free French Forces, or the FFL, who are the head of the FFL is the aforementioned Charles de Gaulle, who installs this guy named Henry Torte. I don't know how to pronounce any of these names. But yeah, de Gaulle, like so do you know about the Free French Forces? You know about de Gaulle, right?
The Free French Forces.
Yeah.
I don't think so. This is maybe these are the people I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I guess during the war, they were a faction of their own that sort of like opposed the Vichy government and claimed de Gaulle to be like the real leader of France or whatever. And I guess
Okay. Well, no, they were not fans of de Gaulle, the people I mentioned. So I'm not sure about this.
okay, all right, never mind. I don't know. That's another fucking story, right? But there was this faction that de Gaulle was head of, and I don't know. I guess as they sort of overthrew the Vichy government, they install their own people. So Fanon, he then goes on and he fights for the FFL, and I think what's probably going on here is like, oh, thank God, they kicked out the Vichys. I'm going to join these people. These are the real freedom fighters, right? Then, as he's fighting, still in World War II, against the Germans and stuff like that, under the FFL, he starts to realize that they're really racist and they still implement a lot of the Vichy government's rules, and it's maybe just a faction. It's like a different faction, but a lot of the spirit is the same and a lot of the dynamics are the same, right?
Yep.
And on a personal level, he says witnesses a lot of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslimism, racism. This is where the pieds noirs come in, the Blackfeet. And he's like, oh, these people are super racist. These are like the fucking gentrifiers, These are the white colonizers who he's forced to work with, who are hella racist. And they start an authentic soul food restaurant in his neighborhood that plays Notorious B.I.G., even though there are no black people that work there, etc. Not really. This is like a metaphor I'm doing. But do you get that I was talking about Brooklyn? Okay, so
Yes.
fought in so he continues to fight with the FFL, and he's even like awarded like honors. Like I can't remember, he's some crazy French crescent, some cross or some shit. Because he's in certain like skirmishes and stuff. But then eventually, like his battalion is sidelined because of the French decision, the French government's decision to remove non-whites from the army as it is becoming possible. So it's like they only use you, when they really need you, and then you're like not allowed to be in the military anymore, right? So here he went to France, and like after he's kicked out of the military for not being white, and he studies psychiatry at the University of Lyon, right? And oh my God, Murray. Oh my God. Okay. He uses his fucking claws when he does this. So here at the University of Lyon,
Jake's skin, black cat.
yeah. Murray skin, white masks. I don't know. So, he studies this. He publishes his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, which is like his breakout thing, right? And he kind of has to publish it by going around the system. Like he increasingly finds the system to be like biased against him and stuff like that. And I think he has to just go straight to this publisher because they wouldn't let him publish it academically or something like that. There's this whole crazy story where the guy who publishes it is also like an FLN freedom fighter type guy. I think this is a white publisher, and when Fanon, like when the guy reads it, he loves it, and he says, "Fanon, this is great," and then Fanon goes, "Hey, not bad for a boop," and does the N word. But he's black, and he's saying that, and it really pisses this guy off. Or it really pisses Fanon off. No, it pisses the guy off. I think it's like this weird thing where the white guy's offended that the black guy said the N-word. I don't fucking know. And this is like this funny story between the two, because later on they're like, no, I respect this person greatly, but there's this weird story about black skin, white masks. Anyway, he goes to Algeria eventually, because he's become a psychiatrist. I think so. There's something a little bit clear to me. There's a very important distinction to me between psychiatry and psychology. And in reading some people writing about this, I'm not sure if they got it right or if I'm reading it wrong or if the distinction just isn't entirely.
So you giving people Prozac and Adderall?
Right. I don't know that it's from what I've read in the book. It sounds like he's a psychologist, but I'm not even sure if the distinction is in play at that point, or what the deal is. But I'm gonna editorialize here and say I think he's a fucking psychologist, because like Wikipedia or something, it says he's a psychiatrist, and I think they might have got it wrong. But anyway, I'm just gonna stick to this, and then if we're wrong, fucking yell at me. But I'm pretty certain that what is going on here would be described as radical psychology, because it's all Freudian case studies and stuff like that. But something to note about his career as a psychologist is that he fucking, after getting discharged whatever from the military, and having all these experiences where he's just like, man, the system is so racist, right? He studies psychology in France, where I've talked about a lot on the show, a lot of the really despicable, like colonizing sort of eugenics, eugenicist almost, like origins of these sciences began not long before this. This is the 50s, but I mean the Fond de Cycle, like I talked about a few weeks ago, that was 50 years before that. I think. Am I getting that right? I think so, yeah. So, like, he's increasingly sort of like having to work in a field where Charles Murray bell curve type shit is established science. Like, he's a black psychologist who has to work with people who are writing papers about like how black people have smaller prefrontal cortex, stuff like that, and this informs his point of view as he's going to go on and see this science used to justify colonization, right? So he goes to Algeria, he practices psychology, and he sort of starts to clandestinely organize with the FLN. Later on in 1957, he'll be deported after the Battle of Algiers and all that stuff. After he gets exiled, he goes to Tunis in Tunisia, and then he just openly is like, fuck it, I'm in the FLN. And he serves like as an ambassador to Ghana, I think. And then in this part of his life, he's diagnosed with leukemia. He's written some things at this point. He's like becomes Fanon as we know him. And like they treat him for leukemia in the USSR. He travels to Rome. He meets Jean-Paul Sartre. And then he writes The Wretched of the Earth while he's dying. This is like his swan song. And the foreword to the book is by Sartre because of all that, how that played out and how much he respected his writing and stuff like that. All right. Pretty cool.
He's writing it also. He's dying in Bethesda, which I always found kind of ironic. Bethesda, Maryland, like the home of some of the worst colonial elites in the modern world, is where he's spending his dying days.
Bethesda, Maryland?
Yeah.
where the Fallout video games are made? That's crazy. I didn't know. Wow. That sucks for him. So let's see. Oh, I should make a note about the pseudoscience I was just talking about. We'll get to that later. But yeah, so let's get into the book a little bit. It's written in a number of chapters that are not really like sequential. It's like a interestingly sort of divided up book. They're just different topics, and it does an interesting like twist at the not a twist, but like it changes form kind of at the end, where he switches from writing what we would think of as theory to a bunch of psychoanalysis, a bunch of psychological case studies, and we'll talk a little bit later about why he does that. But it's a really cool move that I really like, appreciated when I read it. So in the preface, Sartre, like he sort of talks about Fanon and his employment of dialectics and laying out the historical processes that lead to decolonization. Sartre's interesting because he is an existentialist. He's not 100% a Marxist. There's a book, I own it, I haven't read it, but it's about like him sort of balancing the philosophies of existentialism and Marxism in certain ways. And I think that he understands where Fanon's coming from, which is interesting that because Fanon, what he's doing with this book is a lot of Marxism, but also some expanding of it, and then also completely like fusing it with psychoanalysis, which is a third thing that there are other people that's like another philosophy of sorts that there are people who within that who reject existentialism or Marxism or like one or the other or something like that, or reject both. So to have all of these philosophies at play is very interesting. And I think there's a reading of this. Some people might read this and go, oh, this guy, he diverges from Marx, therefore he's not a Marxist. I don't think that's true. I think that Marxism is meant to be expanded upon like this. And if you are reductive about it, you miss the point that it tells you is it's supposed to analyze itself and build and expand as the context of history changes things and stuff like that. That's a big thing that's going on in this book. I don't know. Different people have different takes on it. I think that what I just said is true. So it starts off, first chapter is called On Violence. He talks about violence a lot in the beginning of this book. It's cool. It starts with violence. He starts by talking about how the roles of the native as subordinate and the colonizer as master are enforced via violence, which is, everyone, I think a basic concept we can all understand why you don't reach for a cop's gun and things like that, right? But as a psychologist, as a radical psychologist, this is interesting because he sort of gets into like how that is not just an abstract thing. It's not just, I mean, there's part of it that's pretty abstract, which is just that violence is part of the superstructure of like the state or whatever. But he also talks about how like being a colonized subject, you feel it manifest in your like muscles and in your nerves. And this is where he does something that Marxism fails to really get to itself, at least Marxism up until this point. He's building like an extension of it, which is talk about like the subjectivity, like the how this applies to personal like issues, the human beings we're talking about, you, right? Because a lot of Marxism is very abstract and it's about these big tectonic plates moving in society dialectically, right? And if you talk about something personal, like today, among leftists, you hear a lot of backlash to talking about your lived experience or your body and stuff like that, and your life. These are considered liberal things because they've been weaponized by liberals, and they're weaponizing them because they've come to these, they're getting these things from the legacy of psychoanalysis itself alone, not fused with Marxism, which alone seeks to explain the world through just a small isolated lens that's highly subjective, and it's just about your personal life and stuff like that and your attitude and your whatever the fuck, right? So it's very important that it's all fused together the way he's doing it. It's not just the problem when you're a leftist and when someone says as a fucking black dude or as a woman is not that they're saying that, it's that potentially they're only saying that, and that's what liberals do. But we need to not throw that out, especially if you want to understand Fanon. I would argue, right? He's doing a lot of things that are the basis for that sort of thought. And I think if you read this stuff, you'll understand why it plays into like decolonization and resistance. So he talks a lot about like how the colonizer uses a Hobbesian conception of pre-colonial natives as savages that require violence to be governed paternally. So that's where that like pseudoscience I was talking about comes in.
Mm-hmm.
He's just come from France. He's just heard people talking about how like, oh, Africans don't have a prefrontal cortex. And he's seeing this one-to-one, like, oh, they're using this to make this argument that these people are inherently savages, and that justifies the thing where we came down here and plundered their fucking land and made them into subjects and stuff.
Yeah.
And you see this constantly. You see this if you just open up Facebook right now. You will see someone making the same argument that he was criticizing. Is just like, well, if they don't want to be policed, why don't they fucking just say, you know, hello, Mr. Officer, and suck his dick or whatever, right? It's because they just can't, so they need to, right? Very good origin point for that sort of thinking is calling bullshit on the idea that people are inherently savage and thus need European, you know, more advanced humans to come in and show them how to do everything and keep them from themselves. There's a lot of like, I'm saving you from yourself logic that the colonizer uses here, right? He also notices colonizers' implementation of like the narrative of non-violence, which we hear all the time. Every time we go out in the fucking streets, like, why'd you buy? Martin Luther King said not to do this, right? Stop breaking my window. So, you know, he talks about how that cui bono, who does that benefit? Suspiciously, that benefits the colonizer, and it's a bunk argument. It's a bullshit argument because the colonizer, as he's discussing, rules through the implicit threat of violence. So just like when they tell us, hey, you should protest nonviolently, the answer to that is, well, why don't you fucking be nonviolent, right? Because the system is inherently violent. This is also something that reminded me of like reading stuff that John Brown talked about, where like when he talked about slavery, he was like, it's justifiable for me to go to war because slavery itself is a war of senses.
Yeah.
It's constantly happening, right? There's this threat of implicit violence. You were violent first by doing the colonization, therefore that justifies this resistance. You cannot frame this as, why the fuck did that guy shoot me, right? After you like ate my whole family's house or whatever, right? Very so that's, you know, it's pretty good starting to lay out like how this works. Talks about this he talks about violence as being like pervasive, you know, like air or something like that. So this is the word he's looking for, atmospheric. He says there's an atmospheric violence of colonization that you feel in like your muscles and stuff like that. He is also very critical of the colonized bourgeoisie.
Mm-hmm.
This is, you know, this is a really good thing to take away from this. It's very, very prescient and applicable to fucking everything that they throw at us. I was thinking a lot about like how like during the 2020 George Floyd uprising, like they just started sending in liberal like influencers and stuff, you know, to like to try to become the face of the thing, and then to subtly like talk everyone down from actually implementing anything radical or revolutionary or violent by being like, no, D-rays here. We're going to talk about how this is just about reform, right? So big legacy of this book is talking about the colonized bourgeoisie, the native bourgeois political parties, intellectuals, and how in a decolonized state, so things play out differently than they do in Europe. And this is where he starts to diverge from Marx. And this is where people get weird about that. But I think he makes a very good point here, which is that like the bourgeoisie in a decolonized state, even if you beat back the mother country, it's suddenly like it doesn't function the same way as is laid out in Marx, because Marx is talking about Europe, where the bourgeoisie has access to just like certain wealth
Mm-hmm.
that it doesn't have if it's the colonial bourgeoisie. Like he talks about how the colonial bourgeoisie, after pushing back the mother country, uh, just doesn't have this like massive like wellspring of wealth to then utilize. So what it has is like a deficit and a standing within the fucking world where you're suddenly like broke and you're going around having to beg for like money from other states. And so what does your bourgeoisie do? They're people and they have individual points of views and stuff like that, and that manifests a certain way. So it turns into like casinos and resorts and like a tourism like economy and stuff like that. And uh it doesn't, so he sort of gets to like how like this is not going to be um this is not going to be the thing that does like phase of history shit where it then turns into a socialist government. The proletariat in the colony, according to him, is not like, or in the even in the decolonized part of this, in the urban center, is not like the center point, the fucking the crux, the the point that holds all of the leverage or tension, the way it is in Marx talking about Europe. He says, no. What happens is actually because of the position that the native bourgeoisie is in and the native like national parties that it starts to form, it starts to become very obviously hollow, and there becomes an opposition to it when its own intellectuals in the cities and stuff kind of realize, oh, the national party here is kind of a bullshit sellout puppet government to the mother country, and they then become radical, these intellectuals in the city. And when they become radical, they get fucking beat up by the state, so they get pushed out into the country. And he says what he saw happen in Algeria is this process, and he's studied it in other states, argues that this is like a universal dialectical process in colonies, is that you have like your radical intelligentsia and your like revolutionary professional revolutionaries and that sort of thing reject the city, go to the country, and then find that what they are trying to do functions way better with the lumpen proletariat, which the lumpen proletariat, as defined by him in this situation, is like people out in the country that are like, farmers and peasants and stuff like that, but also criminals and stuff like that. He talks a lot about there being like this, this potential within like organized crime in countries like this that are so economically devastated, where they, frequently turn heavily reactionary, but also could turn into the movement. And like, I don't know, this is making me think a lot about like politically conscious hip hop and stuff like that, where there's just this like question, of like when you're the dregs of society, which way do you take that? And he's talking a lot about his own like experience and having gone out with the FLN and intervened there with Indians' lives and going like, hey, like, okay, we could all just fucking shoot each other and like make the bag, right? But let's talk about what's happening in the government. And he's able to like organize, and the FLN is successfully able to organize peasants, farmers, and criminals and stuff like that.
And how much of that too is these countries may not have a very large industrial base, and so the economy may be more like agriculturally oriented.
I think that's part of it. Because this is probably a little different than some countries where like there's this big industrial economy that suddenly you can nationalize and then turn everything around. Like I feel like that kind of is what went on in like Latin America in certain places.
Yeah.
But something that I was thinking about the entire time I was reading this part is Vietnam, and how there is something that happened when Vietnam like won its own revolution around this same time, where it demanded reparations. And it demanded them because Nixon told Vietnam that he was going to give them reparations when the war was over. And he did that strategically so that he could keep the war going so that he could win re-election. And then Watergate happened and he got ousted, and then Vietnam came around and went, hey, we were promised reparations, and the United States basically went, that you were promised by the old guy and he doesn't work here anymore. And so they never got them. But they were in this position to demand those reparations, and he talks about in this specific point in history, like as a newly decolonized state, you're essentially going to need that because you are not going to be in like at the state to be able to compete with the way that all of these other states have developed to this point, who are now, potential trading partners, potential enemies, whatever, right? And another thing he says about this that's really, really good is about World War II and European states, and how this is a quote, when Nazism made all of Europe a colony, the governments of European nations demanded reparations, and they got them, right? So he talks about how like that happens for all these white European states, but it doesn't happen for these decolonized states in the big D decolonization, meaning brown people decolonizing and getting rid of France and stuff like that. So I think that's like that maybe is a big factor on why his applied Marxism here. He says, things are going to play out a little bit differently, and this also a lot of this reads a lot like Mao. So the focus on the the peasantry and stuff like that. There's probably things about the Chinese Revolution that you could like look at and go, these maybe some similar factors or whatever. Focus on the peasantry, not white and European, probably is part of why that's happening too. But I don't know. This is all stuff that he's thrown out there that's been argued about, but I think it's a pretty interesting point. He says Marxism must be stretched here because things are different.
Okay.
And the proletariat lives in the city and is largely like has the interests of the upholding the mother state at that point. So so things function differently, and he's telling this story and arguing that this is the way that you should do it because he's also telling you he just saw it happen in Algeria and this is how it played out. So I think it's a pretty good basis for an argument. You see that happen a lot, right? He also talks about how liberatory violence, right? And to get back to psychology, like it literally like manifests consciousness in the person. And I think this is like a really interesting point because there's this thing with communist dorks and like a lot of Marxist Leninists and stuff like that, where it's all theory, right? And maybe it's just everyone's got to read the book, right? Everyone's got to read Capital or something like that. And then, and then it's like, well, why do anything, right? That's kind of a pitfall of being like a really, really theory heavy Marxist, I think, is like nothing can happen without like learning consciousness. Then there's like an other end of the spectrum where people are like, I don't care how much you know about the fucking labor theory of value, praxis, delusion, rhizomy, fucking sublimation, insummation, manifest, like just, this is all bullshit. It doesn't mean anything if there's no action, right? So we just have to do the thing, and then communism will happen. And I think Fanon synthesizes both sides of that argument pretty well here because he talks about how like both are essential and both fail without the other. And what he's describing is class consciousness manifested by having gone around and like gone to the people and said like, we got to pick up some guns and fucking resist colonization, and the act of resisting and then also organizing and stuff. Like he says as a psychologist, it resolves this like massive existential unhumanism that was pushed on you by colonization because it inherently creates you as an unhuman, as like a second class citizen who thinks of themselves as such and exists as such. And this is where the existentialism and the humanism comes in, is like the way your consciousness is literally altered by living as that. And I know that sounds for people that like harder scientific material stuff, this might sound like a stretch, but this part really speaks to me, I think, in terms of like understanding all of this as a superstructure. I think if it doesn't speak to you, it might be because you're not someone who is subjugated in this way. There's a term that he talks about.
I mean, the brain is part of material reality. The brain is, yeah, consciousness is a thing. That's definitely, the world has impacts on your personality, and doesn't mean you believe that like soul is real just to observe psychological phenomena.
Or that it's only that
Yeah.
everything can only be explained via that. But he's sort of like kind of arguing that Marxism, is very rational, and it's lacking that a little bit. Marxism doesn't attempt to explain certain things. It kind of stops at a point, and he's going, no, I'm going to bring it all the way to reality because that's where it needs to be for this to happen. And where was I? Okay, so there's a lot going on there. I'm going to put a pin in that. But like, Che loved this part of the book because Che's whole thing was that he had one like guerrilla action that made him into Che, and then from there that turned into the revolution, and then from there everything worked as he had planned with theory when he was a young dorky man who read a ton of philosophy. And so for his whole life, he really his book, his like text was this like guerrilla handbook where he was like the guerrilla guide to revolution, the guerrilla method, like he's selling it on fucking the middle of the night TV, like the Che's guerrilla method. This will decolonize your country or whatever. He got really fixated on that same thing, and it was a very similar idea. It was that the consciousness like manifest in other people and stuff, and he started to feel like, oh, we're like building it, but it's happening through the process of doing it, not just from knowing about it, and not just from picking up a bunch of guns and just going, this will just make it happen. Like you have to also be like implementing the theory and stuff like that and talking to people. So something that Fanon talked about a lot was like going to the countryside where people were being exploited by usurious lenders and landlords and stuff like that and business owners, and fucking explaining it and going like, this is this guy's not giving you a fair deal. And then the FLN would sort of organize the society, and they would do stuff like say like, we're gonna fucking suspend this guy's business, and tell him if he does it again, 3 strikes, we're fucking taking it over, right? And then that person would run his grocery system more equitably, and everyone would sort of get like the basic political economics of it, and then you just be like, we're fucking building it, like. But everyone has, you have to sit down and like have the conversation and go like, all right, everyone sees what this was fucked up about this landlord hiking your rent this high, right? Because he doesn't actually do anything that equals that money and stuff. And this realm of like political economy that's at play here, I think what he's proving, and I think is a really good point, is like a lot of people tend to think of this shit as too smart for the peasantry to understand, or too smart for whatever group you want to talk about to understand. Like I recently was talking about how I don't think that just like being rampantly against identity politics and being like an anti-work person is like good in and of itself, and it's reductive, and there's a lot of problems with that, especially just that. And someone tweeted at me and they said like, oh, like, so you're trying to make abuelas say pronouns and be woke. And I was like, my abuela came on my woke podcast. That I think is something that you can only think if you kind of like are white or have adopted a white mindset about this stuff, because it still actually considers colonized and marginalized people to be too dumb to understand this shit, and that there are all these workarounds. And a lot of what he gets at here is like This is not true. That's actually colonizer mindset. That's the cop in your head that is saying that, no, go talk to black and brown people and colonized subjects and whatever about these things. You'll be surprised. And that's also reflected in, like, I don't know, I was just reading a lot about like the tenants unions out here in LA, and like all the poor people that live in these like black and brown neighborhoods and Asian neighborhoods and stuff like that, you know, they're not as resistant as your fucking land property owning white parents are. They're like, you know, and they're not as indoctrinated with the anti-communism about it. There's a lot of shit that happened out here. They built a really good tenants union out here from fucking abuelas and shit, and they're not resistant to these ideas in ways that I think a lot of this like superstructural shit has had you convinced in certain ways. Not you necessarily, not any you listening, the general you that I suspect thinks this thing. So go to the people is what he's saying. It's, you won't have the same problem that they had in Europe or whatever. So let's see. He also talks about, he uses this term Manichaeism. Manichaeism. Okay, that's what it was. Right. It sounds like mannequin. Which is this ancient sort of like Iranian, I guess Persian concept of dark versus light, and he sort of like, you know, applies that to the racialization here of the colonizer and the subject.
And it's often a moralizing technique. You're good or you're bad.
Yeah, makes sense. Making things black and white, right? Very reductive. There's another section here called "The Trials and Tribulations of National Consciousness." So he talks about a lot about how the main opposition to national consciousness is the national bourgeoisie. So I talked a little bit of that earlier, but he's basically making this argument that, like, you know, a lot of people are going to say build a bourgeoisie and then do phase of history stuff and then try to implement the revolution from there. He says it is nothing good comes from having a national bourgeoisie. As economic contradictions rise and the national bourgeoisie lines its own pockets, serving the mother country, it in effect becomes a puppet of the mother country, helping to stoke factional disputes between races, ethnicities, religions, etc., to divert focus. This is why I think this book appears in the movie Blood In, Blood Out at one point. I did the thing where I pointed at the screen when I saw it, because when they're trying to divide and conquer between the black and brown gangs in the prison in the later part of that movie, someone's reading that fucking book. And I was like, oh, whoever wrote this, pretty smart. They understood what's at play there, divide and conquer. And he sort of talks about this as like part of the dialectical process that eventually, you know, leads to a more solid resistance, but you know, something to like be abreast of, because there's just all this stuff they do with like race and religion that's I don't know, that's like has these subtle, interesting implications. So I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm gonna put a pin in that. Instead of okay, so this is where he gets back to the rural stuff. Instead of the capital for the bourgeoisie to hole up in, he talks about how the Liberatory Party should spread out to the rural parts of the country. And his experiences with organizing grow that. Oh, this is what I wanted to get to a minute ago when I was talking about psychology. So there's a term called double consciousness. It's a W.E.B. Du Bois term, where he talks about like kind of like sorry to bother you type logic, where like as a black person you have to have like two voices, right? And to the extent this makes you feel as though you split your consciousness, you have to be multiple people when you exist, you know, with this constant presence of violence that you have to like please, and then there's this lost sense of self. This is the existentialism coming back around again, right? And the humanism. And I don't know. I think I feel that as like a mixed race person pretty hard, and like the questions of like what is a person are much more apparent to you when you don't really have like you can't even pretend to be like one thing or whatever. You're kind of like subjectively, you know, whatever one of these situations demands that you be, and you're constantly being like, you know, he talks about, you know, all these different ethnicities and races and religions and stuff like that being told that you're subhuman in this way or whatever. And then he gets into national culture. So there's a chapter called On National Culture, and this is really interesting. This is a part of the book where people ask the question, is Fanon a nationalist or not? And I was thinking about a lot in relation to Palestine, because I'm kind of an anarchist, an ANCOM, but I don't like states. I think nationalism has some really dark corners to it. But something like Palestine, I'll wave a Palestinian flag, because clearly what a state is serving a positive purpose in resisting the colonization and genocide and imperialism of the United States and Israel, right? It's at least a tool at that point. He brings this kind of thought to an interesting place where he starts to talk about Pan-Africanism, and he kind of rejects it. He kind of says, like, when you do this, you need to develop a national consciousness first. So you need to become like Algeria before you then become like a neighbor to these other nationalist movements, because, you know, you've all been put in these situations externally, and you actually don't inherently have anything in common with like black people in Chicago, or you're not like homogeneously like equal, right? There are differences because the historical processes put you in this situation. And he says this through arguing the point that actually, like, the concepts of race and ethnicity and stuff like this, but especially race and like blackness, those are things that white European colonizers came up with. So when you do Pan-Africanism is just like this thing that's like, well, we're going to resist as this thing we all have in common, you actually are arguing on their terms as, you know, as a race. And race isn't real. Like, you all have something in common, but it's like as humans in a certain way. And so he makes this really, really finely combed through dialectical argument that he actually kind of is making a phase of history concept argument here, where he's sort of saying, like, you have to become a nation, and then after that, you know, then after like maybe communism or whatever, after that it gets more homogenized again. Very controversial point, but very interesting. Because he's, you know, constantly kind of rolling around these national ideas. Is it good? Is it bad to have like a national party or a national consciousness? Only in certain parts of the process, according to him. There's a lot going on there. And then he talks about like culture and native intellectuals, and I think this is a really interesting point. So within the national culture, the national bourgeoisie in the cities and stuff, you get these like writers and artists and stuff like that. And because their incentives draw them to sort of, you know, kind of become part like French, for example, and like live in France and sort of live, you know, not in opposition to it, but as like an appendage of it, or as a like a subject of it in a lot of ways, or as part of it, I guess. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. He talks about how like eventually a lot of these intellectuals who, you know, they propose to be like professional, you know, culture people, and like argue, like telling you stories about the culture. They do this thing where they actually return from France or from the capital, and they start to approach their own indigenous culture as a foreigner. Very interesting point, in my opinion. So you have like people who are Algerian, and now they're doing this stuff that at first glance almost seems like they're really cool, like they're really down, where they're like, I'm painting a picture of our ancient, you know, indigenous culture here. But you're like, why do you sound like you're from France while you're approaching this with this reverence as if it's entirely alien to you? I thought about this a lot when I was down in Mexico City, because there's this noble savagery kind of thing that, you know, that your brain wants to do sometimes when you go to a place like Mexico City and you're like looking at temples and stuff like that, and you're like, um, you know, I think people don't realize that when they want this stuff to be like really important and like really like something that you perform reverence for, you're kind of like you're kind of like taking on a colonial mindset and implying that it's really ancient and that it's in the past, and that therefore that indigenous group of people, like in this example, Mexican, like, or not Mexican, the country, but like the indigenous people of the fucking part of the world that Mexico is, aren't around anymore. And that they're, you know, we can treat them as like with so much respect because it's like a thing in the past. And now the world you live in is different. And when you're in Mexico, you go, wait a minute, wait, this fucking, that guy's right there though. The guy that's in the carving on the side of the temple is also driving my Uber right now. These people are still here. And I think that's what he's kind of getting at here, is that like separating the culture as a previous thing, a thing that's like previous to the colonizer showing up, helps like sever it from the fact that you should be thinking about it as a process that's continuating into now. And we still are Mexican people, and everything that's happening when we go to a luchador match or watch anime on our fucking phone or whatever, this is all Mexican culture still like happening, right? It's not separate and in a box and in a museum. And if you think about it that way, that really just advantages people that want to exploit you as having been like, no, that's not that anymore. Now you're all, you know, Americans or whatever the fuck. If you're in America, I mean, that's how that goes, right? That's what I was talking about at the top of the show with like, where I think like Mexican American shit is at, where you're no, we shouldn't want to be Americans, right? Or Mexicans or anything. You should be, well, I don't know. I guess Fanon would say be Mexican because national culture comes first or whatever. I don't know. There's a lot going on here, right? Fuck, there's a lot. Okay, so then it rounds out here, and this is where I'm gonna kind of bring it all to a landing point. So after sort of laying out all this like interesting theory and stuff, the final chapter is called Colonial War and Mental Disorders, and it is just a barrage of case studies. It's just a barrage of case studies from his work in Algeria as a psychologist. And it's really presented just as the end fucking credits of this thing. Just the end scene. Not much of a, you know, real kind of follow-up to it. You're just sort of like, you sit with all these ideas, and then you're just beaten with like horror after horror. And I think it's a profound way to end an argument like this, because he's been making all these connections psychologically and saying like, you're not a computer. None of us are computers. This stuff manifests in our bodies, and here is proof, right? He goes through both stories from the Algerian people, from the colonized people, and also stories from like the French occupiers, who both have horrifying mental traumas and debilitations from having been caught up in this systemic thing that like consumes all of us. It's not just, hey, look how fucking horrible this is to the colonized, which, man, I mean, could you imagine doing this with like Palestine right now? Like, it's fucking, it would be gauche, but I think he would be making a hot take here, which is that like that shit probably isn't good for some kid in Israel who's just drafted into the IDF to go fucking blow up people without understanding what he's doing either. They're probably going home and, you know, living with like the manifested violence in them. Not that that's it matters that much in that situation at this point, but like if you're trying to understand the greater thing that's happening here, it's bad. It's bad for everyone, and it's not building a utopia either. That's a good fucking way to argue against what Israel is trying to say about what it's doing. It's like, no, you're making everyone sick with this shit. So I'm going to read a story from the book here. This is the story that stuck out to me because it's so fucking graphic and dark and horrible that I thought it would fit our show pretty well. So there's a guy named DJ he talks about, a former student, a soldier in the ALN, 19 years old. His illness already dated from some months back by the time he came to the center. His appearance was characteristic. He seemed very depressed. His hands were constantly moist, and his lips were dry. His chest was lifted by a continual sighs. Pernicious insomnia. 2 attempts at suicide since the trouble started. During the conversation, he struck hallucinatory attitudes while listening. Sometimes his glance fixed itself for a few seconds on a point in space, while his face lit up, giving the impression to observers that the patient was witnessing a play. Thoughts woolly. Certain phenomena known as psychia try by the name of blocking. Certain phenomena known in psychiatry by the name of blocking. Sorry, this copied and pasted weird. So blocking, a gesture or phrase it begun and then suddenly interrupted without apparent reason. But in particular, one element aroused our particular attention. The patient talked of his blood being spilt, of his arteries, which were being emptied, and of his heart, which kept missing a beat. He implored us to stop the hemorrhage and to not let him be, quote, sucked by a vampire. Within the very precincts of the hospital, sometimes he could not speak anymore and asked us for a pencil. He wrote, I have lost my voice and my whole life is ebbing away. This life, depersonalization, gave us reason to believe that the illness had reached a serious stage of development. Several times during the course of our conversations, the patient spoke to us of a woman who, when night fell, came to persecute him. Having learnt beforehand that his mother, whom he had been very fond of, was dead, and that nothing had been able to console him for her loss, parentheses, his voice had considerably sunk as he spoke of her, and he shed some tears. I directed the investigation toward the maternal image. When I asked him to describe the woman who obsessed him, I might even say persecuted him, he declared that she was not an unknown person, that he knew her very well, and that it was he who had killed her. It was thus a matter of finding out whether we had to deal with the unconscious guilt complex following on the death of the mother, as Freud had described it in Mourning and Melancholia. We asked the patient to talk to us about this woman in greater detail, since he had known her so well, and since it was he who had killed her. Thus, we were able to reconstruct the following story. At nightfall that evening, as soon as the patient went to bed, the room was invaded by women, in spite of everything. It was a manifold repetition of the same woman. Every one of them had an open wound in her stomach. They were bloodless, pale, and terribly thin. They tormented the young patient and insisted that he should give them back their spilt blood. At this moment, the sound of running water filled the room and grew so loud that it seemed like a thundering waterfall, and the young patient saw the parquet of his room drenched with blood, his blood, while the women slowly got their color back and their wounds began to close up. The patient awoke, bathed with sweat and in deep distress, and remained in a state of nervous excitement until dawn. That is a nightmare that someone told to him, right? It was a guy who at 19 years old had killed a woman because of colonization. So this is a Freudian style psychoanalysis, a case study, right? Someone's telling him his nightmares, and he's, making an argument here that it's manifested from something. Seems kind of one-to-one.
Mm-hmm.
But this raises some interesting questions about psychology, right? So he's like, this guy, he's trained in French psychology. He realizes how fucking racist it is. But then he gets really into Freud and psychoanalysis. And, I don't know. So, what am I saying here? This justifies violence. I wrote down, These case studies show us the manifestation of these historical processes in our bodies, both French and Algerian. This justifies. So the fact that, one of the things he's saying is the fact that this stuff manifests itself in the French also is total justification for violence as liberation, because he's saying, I'm going to liberate the French too from this thing that's clearly
That's nice of him.
them. Yeah.
Very generous.
Yeah. Even the colonizer is a victim of colonization. But psychoanalysis is an interesting thing because there are Marxists who use it to explain like the superstructure of capitalism, like Lacan, like Zizek, Deleuze to some extent. But as a Marxist, you can kind of criticize psychoanalysis on the basis that it's like it's focuses around these like ideas like the lack, like the idea that you have these drives and they're based on eternally never having enough. Oh, I really want to eat something. Oh, I really want to buy something. You go to your psychiatrist. I wanted to buy this PlayStation 5 so bad. I got it. I'm still not happy, right? That's psychoanalysis. That's a lack. It's like you have drives. They never end. You have to feel with that. Some people will say, well, this came about around a time in history where it came from the bourgeoisie, and it's like about the experience of being bourgeoisie, and maybe that's not an eternal like state of mind that people are in. Maybe that's just capitalism that keeps you under this spell, right? It's an interesting point, and psychology has largely moved away from psychoanalysis and Freud, but I don't know. I don't think it's moved to a better place. I think it's moved into psychiatry in a lot of ways, where it's even more capitalistic, where it's just like making you a better worker and making you into a concept of health that's defined by capitalism. What he's doing with it here, though, I think it's using the part of it that is true, which is that your brain is a physical being. It's a physical part of the body and stuff like that. I don't know. The book ends. This is where we're just left to ruminate on this really powerful series of images that imply that the bridge between these two philosophies can tell us something about what is to be done here. And he does seem to be kind of also writing this as a what is to be done thing. Like, read this, understand it, and go and decolonize. And that's the book, basically. I think I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great book. I read it in college, so it's been a minute, but I the something I remember being left with is this idea of revolutionary humanism, because in the time since this was written, there's kind of a trend for a while, or a tendency, for lack of a better term, I guess, postmodernism, just kind of the skepticism of humanism and universalism. And Fanon is a good answer to that, I think, because there is something there that all human life has value. It's important and okay to state that as a principle, but it often has to be, there's conflict has to kind of ensue for that to be realized, and that's the struggle we're all in different ways, or we should be.
Yeah, the humanism and the existentialism and the psychoanalysis bridge an interesting gap for me. I think that like because God is dead, and we're too smart to be religious, and we understand it's social control and stuff like that. We're in an existential gap, and what he's doing here is sort of creating like secular answers for these existential problems and combining it and threading it to like history. And that's really important because I don't know, like to me, a lot of Marxists I know seem to conceive of philosophy as this abstract thing and of life as an entirely separate realm. And like essentially like, you know, a history and politics being like a thing that you can have opinions on and that affect people. And then like when you hang out with your friends and get drunk and play Super Smash Bros, that's different. That's like downtime or whatever. And it almost leads to these interesting outputs in terms of like conceiving of culture. Like we have this like weird thing now where there's like, you know, the whole like kind of late 2010s dirtbag left kind of idea was kind of like severed in that way, like the TV show. Like it was like if you had the severance brain procedure and one of your innie did praxis and went to organize at DSA and stuff, and your outie was like, now I can go do racist stand-up comedy, you know? And you're like, these things are separate, so none of them have to do with each other. And he's sort of like, no. What he's doing is the procedure that what is it called when it melds your outie and your innie back into one person. Sorry, spoilers for the show. It's part of the second season 2.
Damn it.
It's like the first episode.
I've not got. Okay.
Wait a minute. No, it's in season 1. They do that to fucking one of the characters. Reintegration. Anyway. So I think that like that severing is like a really like that comes from like people within the imperial core and within whiteness and within America and within like the colonizer part of the thing, understanding that the left is correct, but like not really understanding you're in massive contradiction with where you're coming from as a body, because your culture is still, your body is still programmed to really like a lot of the privileges of being a colonizer, which is fine if you understand it as such. But he's explaining the link between your body and reality and politics and history that I think a lot of us are in denial of right now. And I will expand on that in the future as I digest this, but that's like something that I think that's why I'm like, no, this is good. He cooked when he connected this stuff to the fucking body, and I don't care who doesn't want to hear that word and thinks it's lib shit or whatever.
I mean, the way it is often deployed now, I think, is an abuse of Fanon, and that's
exactly.
But yeah, what he's talking about, yeah,
body is reality, baby. Okay, that's it. That's Wretched of the Earth I read this week. I don't have any shows coming up. If you enjoy the show, though, I don't have any shows coming up, which means I'm going to be holed up in my apartment cooking on this fucking podcast. So if you enjoy the show, please support us on Patreon, where we are making bonus episodes every week. We have a Discord. We'll hang out and talk to you. And we're putting stuff up on video on YouTube and stuff like that. And it helps if you support the show because we don't do ads, and I get an email every week from some fucking brand douchebag that's like, "Dear Pod Damn America, hello, Jake, Alex, and Anders." I think Alex is still on the show. I'm just following up about our possible meeting to hyper consolidate your show and make it crypto boosted and all this stuff, and I never answer him. So please support the show because that's what you have to do to make money in this shit. That's my pitch. All right, thank you very much. Anders, you got anything coming up?
And Anders Lear on social media. Check out Vanquished Podcast. We're on YouTube. And the Roast of Andrew Cuomo is April 4th. If you're listening to this before then, please come on out. It's going to be a hell of a time. We're raising money for the Don't Rank Eric or Andrew for Mayor Independent Expenditure campaign. So, yeah, please come to that. And Silo, April 4th, 7:30. Doors at 7.
It's finished. It's Murray.